she's going to do it. But I know she's going to give you a great talk. So welcome, Julie.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for.
All right. Great. I thank you so much for having me here. The organizers and Kevin Tucker had let me know that there was a great conference happening here, and this is my first time at the dojo. I'm really enjoying seeing the ambiance and the sort of workshop atmosphere here. So I've titled my talk something kind of tongue-in-cheek, a little provocative. Everything you know is wrong. How computing while leading people, will be your enduring challenge. And a lot of this is some of my thoughts and kind of war stories from over the last 5 years or so. I've been working in Silicon Valley for 20 years. Started out my technical career debugging T1 and T3 lines for a ISP that was in a basement, non-air-conditioned basement in San Francisco, and was hands-on for about 15 years, working my way through all the various parts of the stack and spending a good long time doing system administration and site reliability engineering. The last 5 years, I ended up going into management at first, kicking and screaming, but then eventually learning to embrace both the power and the joy of being able to lead others and other teams to fulfill necessary things that had to happen in security, as well as help to grow themselves. But what I wanted to talk about today a little bit is how a lot of the things that you start out and eventually learn to become a proficient engineer need to be either turned on their head or reformulated when you move into trying to lead people. It is a very obvious thing, of course, but it's a hard thing to shake off those habits once you're well into your profession. I took this quote from Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was one of our early Supreme Court jurors, saying that the young man knows the rules, but the old man knows the exceptions, and have found that I'm probably on a certain side of the line now at this point. Okay, so just grabbing some of my notes from here. But I'm going to start with one of the kind of precepts behind being a great engineer, which is that you're showing your work, not just telling it. A lot of times, one of the things that I appreciated most about my first mentor was that we were constantly being asked to prove what we had done and to show it in an almost very mathematical way. And I took that capability or that mindset into every single job I took afterwards, and it worked well up to that point. And this idea of being able to just show your work and being able to demand that others also rise up to that same level of technical language and technical proof was very easy when I was working around people who had the same kind of mindset or maybe the same appetite for learning it as we all did. But it didn't always work when we were working with folks who were coming from a different company or a different company culture, shall I say. So this idea of telling your story and being more verbose or having to go out and set a narrative was almost, I felt almost allergic to when I first started going into management, but then realized that it was completely essential. In some ways, you can see a lot of how that plays out in the political sphere and any kind of cause that you care about. The facts are one thing and the experts know something, but the capability to tell a story that resonates with people who do not know the same things that you know is really important. And it's really important that people who are experts and understand the facts are the ones who are helping to steer that narrative. So I definitely encourage you to look at the full picture on these things. When I'm thinking about examples of what where this comes up a lot, even in the world of open source tools, the prevalence of Linux and how that emerged. In competition and collaboration with, say, BSD, right? I think that's one example of something achieving a great deal of community mind, sure, even while BSD had a great reputation within the technical community, how important it is to get that kind of ecosystem footprint and how much it can determine the end result. In the line of systems that I specialized in, DevOps and the DevOps Sec world, a lot of the configuration management tools such as Puppet and Chef and CF Engine, there were a lot of there was a lot of sort of flag waving around which ones were the better ones during the time, and it may come down to which has a better set of templates or which one is in the language that everyone likes to write. Ruby was very, very popular for a certain period of time. And then eventually that conversation moves to the virtualization and container worlds. And at the end of the day, a lot of the fundamentals never really changed, especially in terms of how you're incorporating security into those layers of the stack. Are you looking at the change where it originally happened? Are you looking at it at each place at which it's being deployed to a new environment? Are you tracking where it's actually triggering an event in your production site and those kinds of things? Those fundamentals didn't really change, but a lot of the layers in between did, and how people were able to steer and get buy-in and enthusiasm can often dictate whether or not technology wins or loses, not just the merit of the technology itself. In the world of security and privacy, right? Security has become such a essential and hot topic now, but I think that in some ways this is because for years so much of what security and site reliability professionals did was somewhat undervalued. And now that the external world is feeling the impact, is now catching up to understand, okay, what is this really? How much is this really hurting us? And what do I need to understand to navigate now? So I think that, being able to tell that story and tell it the right way early on made a difference also in certain aspects of our profession being a little bit undervalued. Here's another one that we like to talk about a lot in technical circles, right? Don't repeat yourself. Incorporate whatever logical change you're doing in one central place, and from there on, things should be extending or leveraging those things. Don't be repetitive. And looking at that compared to what a lot of managers and a lot of leaders end up doing, which is telling that story and repeating it in different ways. I was reading, there was a quote by Jack Welch in one of his books about leadership saying that, you have to be able to provide a vision, and you're going to be telling your vision until you're ready to gag on the words. And I thought that just sounded terrible, but, thinking about it more, the amount of times it takes for people who are doing something different than you to really understand and ingest, what's important there it takes a while, and there's a psychological journey people have to go on along the way. While I was doing a little bit of research for this presentation, there was a book written back in 1855 about advertising. I think the fellow's name was Tom Smith, and he said something on the lines of, it will take your customer 20 times to hear something before they're ready to buy it. So in a lot of ways, coming in and trying to be really concise and terse and not being too repetitive, you have to know what venue you're in and what you're trying to accomplish. Sometimes you're going to have to turn some of this logic on its face because you're trying to reach a new audience. You're trying to bring someone along for a ride and they're not quite ready yet. And you have to start figuring out how to break it down so that they can start really hearing what the benefit is going to be to them. And that takes work on both sides. In my own professional journey, what brought me into the DevOps and DevOpsSec sort of communities and circles after some initial resistance was realizing that I was going to company after company giving the same presentation about DevOps and config management and change management, and why was this the same problem each time. And then I realized the thing that I had been looking at for more than a decade and that seemed so obvious to me was not going to be obvious to other people because they hadn't been subject to the exact same problems or the same experience. And so, at that point I realized that I had to change my own perspective on it in terms of stepping up to communicate. Another aspect I think of moving around from managing a technology problem versus working with people is especially in small startups, we prioritize speed and just getting it done. The result at any cost, even if it means burning the midnight oil or burning through your team's efforts, because at the end, getting there and winning the result is more important than anything else. In larger companies and also companies with a longer ramp, you're going to be looking more at the journey and the destination because you want to be creating a situation where people can sustain and the rules and the processes can sustain beyond just that one project. And so, moving between those two worlds of, the folks who are like really, really fast movers and fast thinkers and maybe a little bit rough around the edges, and then into this environment where, hey, actually, it's not always going to be to your benefit to win every single time. What's really important is also that we're bringing along certain groups, or that we're bringing other departments along for this this ride was also a different kind of inflection point on what is important when you're making a when you're trying to move the needle on these things. In a lot of ways, thinking back on my last few important initiatives for companies, usually uniting compliance and security problems and doing a lot of technical debt catch-up, I always made it a priority for us to make sure we got to that finish line in terms of whether it was PCI or IPO readiness, or making sure we got through that SOX problem. But looking back, I think that part of what we sometimes missed in the urgency for a deadline was that piece about, could people be working at a sustainable pace? Were we building things in such a way that the organization and the rest of the technology could continue to do the work after we had maybe moved on to another project? Would we be able to show that the relationships in the organization actually got better, not worse, because of it? And a lot of that comes back to being able to talk with people as you're going along on a tough project and bringing them to understand why it is a priority and why they're going to benefit from it. It wasn't enough just to win and to get the result at the end of the day. It was just as important to make sure that people understood why. Now, this ended up being both like for people's own quality of life, and I'll even say in being able to make sure that the right people and right departments got credit for the work. If it was not well understood what was the root problem in an organization, or what was the root problem on why we weren't able to get vulnerabilities addressed at a quicker pace, or why were people repeating the same problems over and over, it became very, very easy for folks in other departments to, assign reasons or cause that may be more debatable. So I think that it is very much important to know that the facts alone aren't always going to be enough. Another nice aphorism that ended up having to flip on its head was that idea that premature optimization is the root of all evil, and I think that was credited to Donald Knuth. And working in engineering spheres, I think we have all experienced that need to focus and make sure that we're not working on the wrong thing, that we're not bloating code and creating additional dependencies or security liabilities where they don't need to be, and be able to have that laser focus. Once I started working more with people and the organization and the teams, that mindset didn't necessarily work as well, because there is definitely a complete truth to the idea that you have to build the relationship before something is needed from it. People are more like, people are growing entities, right? They need to be feel taken care of and fed and watered beyond just what I need for this particular transaction at this moment. And I think in the work world sometimes, especially with a lot of urgent deadlines, this can become very easy to forget. And I think some of the things that people look at in terms of what they consider a waste of time, in terms of there's a meeting without an agenda, or I'm having to form these relationships with all these folks that I don't know why yet. Especially in organizations where you're trying to get security to be proactive, not just reactive, this becomes extra important. Being curious and interested in knowing why are the problems occurring where they're occurring, why are there some unexpected things happening in certain places, and why do some people have certain concerns that pop up in places that you just wouldn't expect. All of these things become very, very relevant down the line as you're trying to either troubleshoot a major issue, or sometimes things that become unexpected issues down the road. And of course, I think one of my favorite lessons from having worked at the large retailers was something that one of my mentors told me when we were discussing why was it so hard to get the different departments to coordinate? Why was it so hard to get silos, to reach apart in terms of the development and the operation piece? I think on the engineering side, of course, we get very, very used to making sure that we can prove everything that we're saying and that we're empirically right. But the fundamental point that that I think that was the takeaway for me was not to force logic into emotion, and this idea that it is a different dimension of problem at that point. And when I saw that, I realized, like, when we would get into an argument with a such and such team because they didn't want us to, let's say, for example, that we were moving into an area where we were doing more asset management, which I would think would be a plus for the organization. Maybe another organization would be not that happy about it, and we'd enter in a conversation, and I wouldn't understand initially why it was so charged. Once I stepped away from it for a little while, I realized this is not about necessarily the logical win-win in front of them. There's a reaction to something, some perception of something being taken away that needs to be addressed even before we can have a really rational discussion about how best to make this problem solved for the company. And when I backed off of that concept that we had to approach it completely on that side of, hey, we just need to put this in terms of an argument that the other side is going to understand, and try to step into, like, okay, what are the things that this group are reacting against, and where there might be a little bit of history there that changed the equation in a lot of ways in terms of being able to work beyond just what was the immediate problem at the time. Yeah, that's right. Yes.
The way you just talked to that example, give me an example of what you might say.
Sure. So I think, I'm a believer that the roots of a solution are in the seeds to a solution are in the roots of the problem. So what you just described, okay, so I'm talking to a developer and saying, hey, you've got a really high proportion of these kinds of bugs, and they're getting offended. Understanding, okay, this person has, like, they want to believe that either they don't make that many bugs, or that they are having someone else bring it to them is an issue. And so I think that, part of it in that kind of situation is to let them know that, hey, this is not that unusual necessarily, and so therefore this is just part of what we're doing as a development. This is just part of being an engineer and needing to be better. You don't have to take it personally. But I think when you're seeing someone react, let's say with ego first, right? I think it's stepping back to say, like, okay, is this something that we can work with here? And this is where you have to use all of your both relationship and EQ skills about, like, is this something we can work with in terms of getting them to understand this is just something you can get better at, Like our former speaker who was up here was saying, the knowledge piece can be taught, right? If it's something where it's maybe a little bit more entrenched, and I've encountered that as well. Sometimes I took two approaches, right? Let's say, for an instance, we were having issues getting a remote manager to agree to some things that we all knew that the company needed. And and I could see that there was a lot of investment in this idea that the way that this person wanted to do it was a higher standard than everybody else's. So therefore, he had totally dug in his heels about not bending on that standard. We had to approach it from the perspective of from a managerial standpoint. We definitely had to work with his manager as well and have a reasoned conversation about, hey, here's our alternatives, help us pick which one's going to be the best here. And also a picking the battles kind of aspect. Like, I don't have any kind of illusion that there's going to be perfect results to this. It's just people trying to grow the org at the same time as you go. But I think you do.
That's a good approach, giving them options, right?
Yeah. That's right.
Be able to go in and take off either two of those at the same time or one of them and start.
That's right. Yeah, make them part of the solution. That's always a little bit better. And I totally, his manager as well was there to say, like, hey, if we don't make a choice, that's unacceptable. So we must make a choice, So I think that combination of things kind of helped get us around the bend on that particular issue. But, definitely there's, it's... Yeah. Yeah, that's right. I mean,
here's a little more
Absolutely. If he takes pride in the quality of his coding, he takes pride in being, let's say, the best developer, one of the most proficient developers in the org, help give him more tools to be that person, right? And I think especially with security being so interesting and so critical nowadays, there's a lot of ways to bring people into the fold in that respect. More and more these days, and you all probably experience this too, people approaching our teams, myself, asking how to get into security, what should they be learning about, and this and that. And so I think in that way, the folks who you're actually engaging with and you can get a reaction from, you have a chance there. The problems are like where you have like silos or no response. I think if you can at least get a reaction from someone because they have some kind of investment in it, there's a shot. Yeah. So I kind of put the slide here at the end because one of the things that I found when kind of switching back and forth between the technical and the people aspect of it is sometimes just having to re-find footing because turning those ideas of like whatever it was that I felt made me a good engineer into something else. I would have to come back and say, okay, like where am I on this and where what's the situation? And I think what the message I want to give is that there is a path through in terms of finding a center, finding a place that you can work from that still has integrity to you as an engineer, but allows you to grow other people. But it does require constantly adjusting and constantly being on your toes and knowing who you're working with. And so I think bringing that into the fold and understanding that there's a progression to how everyone is learning as engineers and as other managers, that they gradually become more informed, they gradually become more flexible, kind of helps that process along. And those are the major kind of points that I wanted to talk about today in terms of what I felt had to be changed between those worlds. If anybody has any other questions or any kinds of stories they'd like to share from their own experiences, I'd welcome hearing them. Thank you. Yeah, sure. Thanks.
Julie, where do you educate yourself? Do you go to Open DevOps and speak there, or
Sure.
Depends
on the area, right? Like, so for the DevOps and infrastructure and tooling and all that kind of stuff, I do like the all-day DevOps groups, and DevOps Enterprise has been a great contact source as well. I think you go in there, and what's great is you can go in with a problem, and then as you're working with other folks who have the same problems, you guys can come up with the solutions together to state the obvious. But you start out with a little bit of uncertainty and then end up moving into better places. For application security, of course, the OWASP stuff is a good place to start. I really like some of the stuff that I'm seeing with the secure developer and Shannon Leitz over at Intuit have been talking about adversary-focused application security as opposed to just the OWASP top 10, which are obviously very important also. I think those two things plus like a good knowledge of threat modeling and actual internal threats and weaknesses would be a decent way to go about that. Obviously, Bruce Schneier's blog is always a good one to resource. I try to find where I think the most specific experts are. Yeah. Oh, I didn't say that, but it is a good thought. Yeah. I would say most of my career has been focused on the blue team side of it, coming up from infrastructure and all of that, and so that's been the aspect of it. Thank you.